Hey, this is George. Have you ever heard of Anchor.fm? It's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. Number one, it's free. Number two, there are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so you can hear it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Check out Anchor.fm on the iOS and Android systems.
Need psychotherapy online or in person? Check out tinyurl.com/THT psychotherapy. The George Brassey podcast is made possible with funding provided from Brassey Global Strategies, LLC, a leading political consulting, public policy, government affairs, and research firm. Are you interested in running for elected office? Need advice? Call or email George, 708-769-5015. Brassey Global Strategies 1@gmail.com.
Snowstorm forces Chicago Heights to close City Hall. Snowstorm forces Chicago Heights to close City Hall, Chicago Heights, Illinois. Snow was on everybody's mind at Wednesday night's Chicago Heights City Council meeting. The Chicago area was hit by a major snowstorm, and Chicago Heights had about 10 inches of snow dumped on it Tuesday and Wednesday. City Hall was closed Wednesday afternoon because of the winter storm, and garbage pickup on Wednesday and Thursday was also postponed. And students at Chicago Heights School District 163 went to remote learning Wednesday because of the storm. The mayor's chief of staff, Karen Zaranti, thanked city workers for their efforts. She told the council that city workers had been working round the clock to keep city streets open and safe, and would continue to do so throughout the duration of the storm. Fifth Ward Alderman George Brassey also lauded city workers, saying, "The snowstorm we have experienced in recent days has been terrible, but the City of Chicago Heights Public Works Department has done an excellent job in maintaining the roads during the snowstorm. Each and every resident's request that was submitted to my office was addressed in a quick and efficient fashion." Christopher Bykoskas, 4th Ward Alderman, added that Public Works is working diligently, doing a great job cleaning up the streets. In other business, Zaranti said that the city would be hosting its second Illinois Department of Public Health clinic offering vaccinations and booster shots 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. Saturday, February 12 at City Hall. The council also approved an ordinance renewing the city's employee health insurance policy and premium. The city expects to see premiums remain roughly the same. The city's benefits and insurance consultant told the council that he was able to negotiate lower rates with its insurer, Blue Cross/Blue Shield PPO, despite higher prescription drug usage by the 231 employees covered under the policy. Snowstorm forces Chicago Heights to close City Hall.
Before we get to the interview, I just want to tell you about our newest sponsor, Union Signs and Printing. Union Signs and Printing is a union sign shop located near Chicago, Illinois, that specializes in the production of corrugated plastic lawn signs used in applications ranging from political and election usages to unions, schools, and businesses. They also produce a vast array of other products, including American-made, union-printed t-shirts, banners, bio cards, literature, door hangers, business cards, and trifold. Get a hold of Union Signs and Printing at 815-740-1688 or find them on the internet at unionsignsandprinting.com. And don't forget to tell them you heard about their services on the George Brassey podcast.
Check. Hello.
Hey, Chuck. I'm so glad to have you on my podcast.
Yeah, thanks for your patience and thanks for working with me.
No problem. I'm surprised. I know you're a fellow podcaster, and I was surprised you don't use Anchor, but you sound great.
Thanks. Appreciate that. No, I've never even heard of it. So, but we're good.
Yeah, it might be worth checking out. It's a really easy tool. And this is not a plug for Anchor.fm.
Yeah, no, it's good. We use Zencaster really, and that works pretty well too.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad to welcome author Chuck Marohn to the podcast. Chuck is the author of Strong Towns, a bottom-up revolution. Chuck, tell the audience a little bit about the story behind the story. What led you to writing this book?
Oh, wow. Well, I actually started a blog back in 2008 trying to really understand for myself. Writing is kind of a process of discovery. So trying to understand myself why our cities were going broke. I do engineering and planning, and I've worked for cities for many years. And despite all the investments we were making in infrastructure and economic development and job creation, the cities that I was working with were falling further and further behind, as were, other cities that I could observe. And so I started this blog to try to answer that question, why? And the book is, comes after a decade of writing 2-3 times a week, every week, all year, dealing with and answering that question. And I tried to take the reader on essentially a quicker journey than the very tortuous, long, process of discovery that I went through.
Chuck, when you say you're an engineer, tell the audience a little bit about what that means in your context.
Yeah, well, I have a civil engineering degree. Civil engineering are the types, we like to say we're the oldest engineer. It goes back to, some of the stuff we did goes back to Roman times, how to build roads, how to build bridges, how to build, waterworks and drainage systems and that kind of thing. So my background, my engineering work was working for cities. I did a little bit of interning with the Department of Transportation when I was an undergrad. But then when I graduated, I started working for a consulting firm, and we did municipal projects. So I worked on new developments, building the streets and designing those, the pipes under the ground. I got to work on an airport project once. So that kind of stuff, that's what engineers do. And that's where my passion is. And it's interesting because, the Biden administration right now is proposing this $4 trillion, something in that range, infrastructure bill. And that's the kind of stuff where engineers, that money, a lot of that money is going to be directed by our nation's civil engineers, determining where that should go and how it should be spent and what are good projects and how we deploy that capital.
Chuck, you mentioned the infrastructure plan. Do you think, from what you've seen so far, that the Biden administration will be friendlier to people who are not in cars?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that is a thrust of, certainly the rhetoric around it is that. And I think certainly, a lot of the emphasis on spending is that. I think the thing that I question and the thing that I struggle with is whether this is really a problem that is going to be solved by money. You have a system set up, and that system does roads really well. It does, walking infrastructure less well. It tends to do it as an appendage to an auto-based system. And so if you push more money into that system without reforming it, without changing the priorities, without changing the approval processes and how you would, evaluate a project one against another, are you going to get a result that is really, human-friendly cities and human-friendly places? Well, we would call it strong town sense, productive cities. Or are you going to get a lot more auto infrastructure with, some blinged out appendages for people who walk kind of attached to it? And I think that is yet to be determined. But, either way, there will be an advancement for people who walk. That is kind of an emphasis, a core emphasis of this administration's transportation rhetoric at the very least, and seems to be their funding priorities.
Chuck, I'm on the city council where I live, and we are a very auto-dominated city. Talk a little bit about what type of economic impacts kind of an auto-dominated city has for the residents.
Yeah. Well, welcome to America, right? I mean, you just gave a description of your city that makes it so I can't really identify which one it is. Because I mean, this is all of us, right? We're all in this.
In our specific context, our moniker is actually called the Crossroads of the Nation. Lincoln Highway, Dixie Highway, which are two of the original transcontinental highways, intersect right in the middle of our town. So it's been an auto-dominated place for almost ever. But talk a little bit about, broadly speaking, the differences there.
Well, you and I could chat for hours and hours about the many implications of this. If I were going to simplify it down to like a couple tweets, when you take a city, and we think of cities like pre-Great Depression as being these kind of compact places where everybody walked everywhere, you would get there by train or by boat or eventually by car. But even when you got there by car, you would get out and you would tend to walk everywhere. The idea that on a normal day, walking a mile, walking 2 miles, walking 3 or 4 miles was not something that was out of the ordinary. You take a city like that and you essentially keep, the same buildings, the same people, the same everything, but you just spread it out over this huge area. If we look at my city, back at the end of World War II, it was a little under 14,000 people. Today, it's a little under 14,000 people, but it's 10 times the area. So you take that and you spread that kind of, you can think of it as energy of a place. You spread those buildings out, you spread all that out over this huge area. What you end up with, just from a municipal budget standpoint, is a slightly greater tax base. I won't deny that, doing this gave us more buildings and more transactions and more stuff in a sense, but you wind up with an enormous amount of liabilities. Now you have 10 times the road. Now you have 10 times the pipe. Now you have 10 times the infrastructure, the area that you need to drain, and handle the water run. You have all these things like exponentially magnified. And so from the city's balance sheet, what ends up happening is in the very short term, when this stuff is brand new, you get a lot of growth, you get a lot of new tax base, you get a lot of new revenue, you start to feel kind of very rich. But then when all of that maintenance comes due, when you actually have to go out and fix that road and fix that pipe and repair things, what you find is that you don't have anywhere near the wealth or the capacity to do it. And it's really a function of return on investment. We talk about sometimes the private to public investment ratio, which sounds like a really complicated math problem, but it's not. How much private wealth do you have and what amount of public investment can that support? If we go back to pre-Depression cities, it was about a 30-to-1, 40-to-1 ratio we would see in places. Today, we see cities where it's 1-to-1 or even lower than that, where it takes a dollar of public investment to support a dollar of private investment. And if you think about having to tax that private investment in order to pay to sustain the public portion of it, we have to tax ourselves to fix our streets. That's just kind of the nature of the way a city is. If you're at ratios of 1-to-1, that's impossible. If you're at ratios of 10-to-1 or even 20-to-1, it's difficult. And so, we have grown our cities very aggressively, and we've experienced a lot of transactions and the type of prosperity that comes from transactions along with that. But we have accumulated massive levels of liability, and those are really starting to bite now in a way that, can't be ignored, and has created kind of a cascading level of not just failure, but also, tension and I think distress.
One of the things I found interesting in your work is how you view the built environment of a place. Can you talk a little bit about the concept of a strode?
Oh, yeah. When I first came up with this term, I capitalized it because engineers love acronyms. And I thought, if I write this in all caps, they will look it up and then they will learn something. So if we look at a street, A street is different than a road. And let me draw two distinctions. A street is a platform for building wealth, is what we call it here. A city is made up of streets, that you basically have streets so that you can have houses and buildings and things that create a place. A street is like a framework for your place. A road is different than a street in that a road is a connection between places. If you think of a railroad, it's a road on rails. You get on at one spot and you get off at another spot. That's a road. When we build streets, we can create a lot of wealth with a modest amount of investment. When we build roads, we can create a lot of prosperity because we can move people at distance and do it in a very cost-effective way. But when we combine the two together, we get this thing that at Strong Towns we call a strode. It's a street road hybrid. We describe this as the futon of transportation. If you think of a futon as being an uncomfortable couch that makes into an uncomfortable bed, the strode is a piece of transportation infrastructure that both tries to create wealth and place and economic development and jobs, while also trying to move people very, very quickly. Most of America today is built, transportation that are non-highways and non-interstates are built as strodes. And in a strode, you have an environment where even though it's designed with very wide streets and forgiving shoulders and all the kind of engineering attachments that make people able to drive fast, we also have added the big box stores, the residential developments, the franchise drive-through restaurants, the strip malls, all that stuff that forces you to slow down because of all the intersections and all the traffic signals and everything else. And so you wind up with kind of the worst of both worlds. You wind up with a really, really expensive piece of infrastructure that is also really dangerous to be in because you combine high speeds with turning movements, becomes very dangerous very quickly. You have that, and you also have the least productive development pattern. You have a development pattern that everything is all spread out, really, really high cost, low value per acre, or low levels of financial productivity. And you wind up with kind of the worst type of environments. That is what a strode is. It's the lowest returning transportation investment we can make.
And they are very popular in our country.
Yeah.
Is that because of the transactional nature, in your opinion?
I think that's at the core of it. Yeah. It's interesting because I think if when we as a country step back and do the math on these developments, it's not a hard equation to figure out, this short-term versus long-term trade-off. But when you look at our macroeconomy, and I've been particularly frustrated recently with economists, around this infrastructure bill at the federal level, there are all these economists out there saying, with interest rates so low, this is a free lunch. We can go out and build as much infrastructure as we want, and we get a free lunch out of it. We get all this growth in GDP, and it's not costing us anything because interest rates are so low. And that's a ludicrous statement, because yes, if your interest is in next quarter's GDP, spending on infrastructure today is fantastic. It gives you this huge multiplier boost. It's wonderful. You will get new big box stores, and you will get new residential subdivisions, and you will get new franchise restaurants after you do this stuff. I mean, it really gooses GDP really well. If you are a local government, or let me just say this more, I think personally, if you are a community of taxpayers and citizens invested in a place, physically invested in your home, emotionally and well-being invested in the future prosperity of this community, every one of those transactions brings with it a modest amount of short-term gain with a comparatively enormous amount of long-term liability. And you are getting poorer every time we do it. That doesn't show up in, the CBO accounting of the federal government's, the Biden administration's proposal. It didn't show up in the, in the Trump administration or the Obama administration or the George W. Bush administration's proposal. So this is not like a partisan thing. This is a completely, different levels of government have different ways of accounting. But yeah, we've created an economy that can goose GDP really well by throwing a bunch of money at infrastructure. The side effect is we make our families, our small businesses, and our local communities struggle long term.
Chuck, where I live, I'm a big proponent of improved conditions for people on bikes, including and up to protected bike lanes. Do you feel that protected bike lanes improve cities?
It's a broad statement, and I have trouble with broad statements. So let me, I think in a broad sense, the answer is yes. But I think there's actually a more important insight there, because I have seen engineers build protected bike lanes in places that are absurd. And I've seen places where we need them desperately, where they refuse to, put them in because they don't meet the manual uniform traffic control devices or whatever other, obscure, theological document they're referring to. I think that to me, the important insight is this. When we look at cities today, the highest returning investments that we can make are the ones that get people out of their automobile and make it easy for them to get around by walking and by biking. Of those two, biking is the one that is most compatible with a city in transition. And by that, I mean, you described your place as one that's very auto-centric. And to me, that would mean very spread out. Yes. If you want to build a city that is walkable, that is a great thing to aspire to. When we see places where people are outside of their automobile walking around, we can do the math on those places. And what we find is that financially, those are places that are strong, viable, attracting investment. They're hitting on all cylinders. But if you can't build that energy in a place quite right away, because your place is so spread out, and the idea of people walking is just, it's too much of a burden. If you can transition with getting people out biking, what that is like a force multiplier for people walking. A nice walking area is 1 to 1.5 miles. If you can make a neighborhood that's, a 3 mile diameter, 1.5 mile radius, and you can get your daily needs in that area, and you can, find work, find jobs, find someone to fall in love with, all that stuff in that area, you are building a place that is going to be really successful financially, like very stable. When you switch over to a bike, you can start to expand that radius from 1.5 miles to like 3 miles or 4 miles. And so all of a sudden now, if you're focusing on bike infrastructure, you can take an existing city that is very spread out and start to make it so you can create lots of investment opportunities that just aren't available in a community based solely on automobiles. And let's be clear, when you have to store an automobile, when you have to have a parking lot appendage to every building, and that parking lot has to be huge. And if you look at a lot of auto-oriented cities, the parking lots are often larger than, sometimes even doubles the size of the actual building itself. That is a huge financial millstone around the community's neck, because those places are all going to have infrastructure. They're all going to have these very expensive public investments, and they will produce very little tax base. As soon as you can get people biking, you don't, not only do you not need that much parking, you don't need that much parking now, but you really don't need it then. But you can start to create kind of a momentum around converting a lot of that stuff into things that are going to be more productive and more higher yielding for you. And financially, it's kind of the gateway to building places that are truly more walkable and financially a lot more successful.
With that, can you talk a little bit about the walkability score and its relationship to property value?
Well, this is research that others have done, and I think it is, to me, the interesting answer is why more than what. But the what is pretty easy. Walkability is a measurement of how much walking infrastructure there is in your neighborhood, how many places you can reach by a decent walk, how safe that walk is. There's a number of criteria that is used to create walk score, but generally, if you go to a place with a high walk score, what you find is that it's pretty easy to get around and pretty comfortable to get around. And that walk is not just easy and comfortable, but it's actually useful. Like you can get to things that matter. When you take a map of walk score and you overlay it with a map of property values, or in the case of the things that I've seen, like a group out of Urban 3 in Asheville do, financial productivity, which is highly correlated to return on investment. So where are the places where you're making money as a community instead of losing money? The correlation with walk score is, 99%. I mean, the places with really high walk scores are really financially productive. Those are the places where you're doing really well. The places with low walk scores, as soon as you start to drop down, the cost goes way up and the return, the financial productivity goes way down, and you start to lose money really quickly. If you can get walk scores, above like 70, 80, it's on a 1 to 100 scale. You're doing really well. I mean, financially, even neighborhoods that we look at and say, this is a poor neighborhood or this is a disadvantaged neighborhood. When they have high walk scores, their financial productivity is really high. You can take really wealthy neighborhoods. You're like, wow, this is where all the affluent people live. And, when they have low walk scores, it tends to correlate really well with financial productivity. You're like, yeah, there's a lot of wealthy people who live here, but they're being subsidized by the rest of the community. These are actually money losing investments for us.
Chuck, what are 2 books that you would recommend to the audience that have been influential to you as a person, and why?
That's a great question. I've read everything that Nassim Taleb has written. And I actually think Nassim Taleb, he's probably best known for The Black Swan. But before that, he wrote a book called Fooled by Randomness, and he's followed it up with Anti-Fragile and Skin in the Game. And he's really kind of a modern philosopher. And his insights are really that we as humans are very poor at estimating risk. But history and nature and ecosystems, all of these things are much better determinants of risk and reward than anything that we will do with a calculator or a spreadsheet or hubris today. And he taught me the mechanics of humility, basically, I think would be the way to state it. So I would recommend anything by Nassim Taleb. I think he's just, probably had the greatest influence on me.
Great. Well, Chuck, it's an honor again to have you on. I've listened to your podcast myself. I've read your book. I've given your book to plenty of my colleagues on the city council. And thanks again. If you're ever in Illinois, come look us up in Chicago Heights, and hopefully by then we'll be a more walkable and bikeable city.
George, I would love that. And just a final word. Thanks for what you do. Being on city council is a thankless, difficult job. And I really have, we're very critical sometimes of decisions cities make, but I'm never critical of people because it's a hard job. There's a lot of compromise. There's a lot of difficulty that goes into it. And just thanks for doing that work. It's very important.
Chuck, if somebody wanted to look you up and find you on the internet or work with you, how would they get a hold of you?
Man, strongtowns.org is our website. You can get connected to, all of the articles we write, the podcasts we do, the videos we produce, the academy courses we've created a whole series of courses for people that they can take. And then any events we do are all listed there too. So it's a wealth of information. We're also on every social media platform you're going to find yourselves on, except for TikTok. My kids keep telling me we need to do that. And I don't know, maybe someday.
You're in good company because I'm not on there either. So thank you. Take care.
Hey, thanks, George. Take care.
Help George stay on the Chicago Heights City Council. Go and donate today at tinyurl.com/AldermanGeorge 2023. Need more George? like his pages on Facebook: Friends of George Brassey PAC, Fifth Ward Business Alliance, Chicago Heights Bicycle and Pedestrian Resource Center, and the George Brassey Podcast.